Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Paolo Frascà, who is an assistant professor of Italian studies at the University of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. His work focuses on three main areas: pedagogy, particularly the teaching of Italian language and culture through a sociocultural approach and through collaborative methodologies; migration studies, with a focus on Italian-Canadian community and its histories, languages, practices, and cultural production; sexuality and gender studies, specifically queer theories and the Italian gay liberation movement of the 1970s. Before joining the University of Toronto as a faculty member, Paolo Frascà taught courses in language, culture, translation, literature, migration, and sexuality at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and at Brock University. Professor Frascà has published several peer-reviewed essays in recognized scholarly journals and volumes, and in areas that span from social linguistics to dialectology and the intersection between migration and queerness. He is co-director of two projects at the University of Toronto's Frank Iacobucci Center for Italian-Canadian Studies, and another project which is called Queer Italian-Canadian Artists, together with Dr. Licia Canton. Professor Frascà also oversees a number of experiential and cultural activities in his role as language coordinator. Additional roles at the University of Toronto include steering committee member and affiliated faculty at the Mark Sanbonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies and co-lead of the Global Language Initiative. He is a contributor and a member of various local international organizations, including the Endangered Language Alliance of Toronto and the Centro Universitario di Ricerca sul Queer. Professor Frascà strives to integrate discussions on social justice, equity, and decolonization into his courses, and considers himself a community-oriented educator and researcher. So thank you, Paolo, again for being here with our guest, and thank you very much, for your forthcoming seminar. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Silvia. Such a pleasure to reconnect. We miss you here in the department, so it's really nice to be in your class virtually. Just wanted to check in about audio and video. Are you able to see the full slide on the screen, as well as maybe me, and hear me okay?
Can hear you, yes.
Okay, perfect. And the screen sharing is working okay. All right, so good morning, buongiorno, buongiorno qui in Canada, buon pomeriggio in Italia. So nice to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Paolo Frascà, and I am from the University of Toronto. I'll introduce myself a little bit, and what I like to do when I introduce myself, even though we are scholars, we are intellectuals, we are academics, I really value ancestral teachings. And so I always start with a proverb that my Nonna Maria, taught me in Calabrese, which is my ancestral language. This poem is, this proverb is the one you see on the screen, A Petra che non faccio lippu non ci leva a chiumara. So the rock that does not build moss around itself, muschio, will be taken away by the river. Okay, and this is how I sort of root myself in my Italian-Canadian experience. I see myself as a rock, having moved from Tropea, Calabria, to Canada when I was 13 years old. I see myself as a rock that was moved, but that was able to find some rootedness, some groundedness in this new place. And today we will be talking about my community, the Italian-Canadian community. And so I want to ask some questions to see how much you know about Italian Canadians. So questions for the class. How many Canadians of Italian origin are there today? So how many Canadians of Italian origin are there today living in Canada, do you think? Try to take a guess. This is not an exam.
How many do you think there are? Just give a guess.
Are we in the hundreds of thousands?
Somebody says 6 million. Somebody else, come on, guys. How many Italian Canadians of Italian origins do you think are there currently in Canada? 5 million?
Good guesses, good guesses. So a little bit less than that, actually. We are at 1.6 million. Considering the Canadian population is 40 million, this is quite significant. And the concentration of Italian Canadians is in 3 provinces: Ontario, where the city of Toronto is located, where I'm speaking to you from today, my office at the university, Quebec, the French-speaking province, particularly Montreal, and British Columbia, where Vancouver is, so on the West Coast. Those are the largest Italian Canadian communities, with the largest being the one in Ontario. There are about 800,000 to 900,000 Italian Canadians in this province. And by province in Canada, we mean what in Italy we say when we talk about regione. So a province is quite vast here. So the population of Ontario is 8 million, about 8 million. 9 million maybe now. So Italian Canadians are about 10% of the population in Ontario. And of course, Italian Canadians are located also outside urban centers, not just in the cities, particularly around mining establishments or other kinds of places that historically attracted a lot of manual workers, manual laborers. As you can imagine, let me ask you this question. What are the most demographically represented Italian regions in Canada, do you think? Another little trivia question for you.
They say Sicily. Any other regions? Calabria?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good guess. Yeah, so mostly southern regions, Sicily and Calabria being amongst the top regions, and with the exception of Friuli. So there's a large community of Friulani here in Canada as well. And so, with the Calabrese community being the highest in numbers. And a fun fact is that we actually have a direct flight from Toronto to Lamezia Terme once a week from June to October. So that's how present we are in also the economy of Canada as Southern Italians. And Italian spoken widely in Canada? We could say yes, but of course this needs to be nuanced by the fact that most Italians who arrived here during the largest waves of migrations did not speak standard Italian or neo-standard, right? They spoke what we call dialetti, right? Of course, that's a misnomer, but we'll go with that. And so that's a question that, for example, the Canadian census does not account for. It just asks what language, and Italian is one of the options, and then everything gets lumped in together as Italian. But we know that really means Barese, Siciliano, Calabrese, Abruzzese, and so on and so forth. And the number of Italian languages speakers is dramatically decreasing here in Canada, because the first generation of migrants, so the migrants who were born in Italy and moved here, are now getting older and unfortunately passing away. And so the number of Italian speakers or Italian languages speakers is drastically diminishing. So here I'm giving you a little bit of context for the Italian Canadian situation. I'm going to continue, and this is important. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it means to be Italian on this land. I know I have to talk to you about a project called Queer Italian Canadians, but this is really important because it really grounds the project. It really gives it context, and it connects it to other issues as well. So as you know, Canada is a very young country, as young as Italy, actually, 1867 Confederation. So 6 years difference in terms of becoming a nation, a unified nation state, in our case, a confederation. And of course, we know that Canada is a colonial project. We know that Canada was colonized by European powers, particularly the English and the French. And we know that people lived here before Europeans arrived. The very first European known to history to have arrived is Giovanni Caboto, an Italian, quote unquote. I mean, he probably did not define himself as Italian, probably Veneziano or Genovese. But it's quite important to think about the fact that the presence of people from the Italian peninsula in what is now called Canada is quite historical. And so we need to think about what it means for Italians to be on this land, on this colonized, on this stolen land, right? And I have a few images here for you that I'd like to share. And the first image you see here is one of the earliest treaties, trattati, treaties, between indigenous people. It's called the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty, and it's about sharing the land between indigenous nations. Now, we know that, of course, indigenous nations that existed here before Europeans arrived were not just one group. It's as diverse as Europe, if not more. Many language families, not just different languages, but a number of language families. And so nations, indigenous nations, like the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Stolo Nation, and so on and so forth, learn to be with one another and often were at conflict with one another. So one of the earliest treaties that we know about is the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty, which also applies to settlers, to colonizers. And there's one dish, which you may be able to see here. This is a wampum belt. It's made by little shells, piccole conchiglie. And you see one dish here, which means that there are limited resources, that the land offers limited resources, and that we have to share the resources mindfully, okay? Another early treaty here is the Gaswenta. This is one of the very first agreements, and these treaties, these belts, are actual documents, okay? They have legal value, these wampum belts. And this is called the Gaswenta, or the two-row wampum. So you see the two rows there. And what this particular treaty teaches us is that indigenous nations can row along the river in their canoe, while European nations can also row along the river in their boat, and they cannot interfere with one another. There is a philosophy of sharing, and there are three wampums between the two lines. There are three wampum shells, which mean peace, friendship, and forever. So we want to understand what it means for Italian Canadians to be here before we talk about issues of queerness and sexuality. Other images here that speak to that connection between settlers and indigenous nations are street names. So naming practices. We have Spadina Avenue, one of the most important and most trafficked streets in Toronto, with its indigenous name, Ispadina, which means the uphill road, La Salita. And here we have, in the Toronto sign, we have the Canadian flag, the maple leaf, as well as the medicine wheel, which holds a lot of teachings, a lot of teachings with respect to indigenous worldviews. Okay. I have a quote here by an indigenous scholar, Stacey Taylor, who says, "As indigenous people, we are deeply connected to our history, our ancestors, and the land. Even though cities like Toronto cover and hide it, our past is still there. We just have to see. The ancestors walked before us, but they are still teaching us." Okay. Another important quote from a really interesting book called Indigenous Toronto, Stories That Carry This Place, that talks about treaties, is by Wanda Nanebush, who says, "While treaty recognition is a very important step in the right direction, the Anishinaabe, and Anishinaabe is one nation here in Ontario, the Anishinaabe notions of land stewardship and communal relations with non-human beings need to come back to the forefront of discussion of land. We speak in ownership terms because that is what is understood in the white world we inhabit. But if we could, as Anishinaabe writer Gerald Weisner has asked, if we could unwind ourselves from the white words we have become, le parole bianche che siamo diventati, the idea that all lands are there to sustain life in a collective stewardship model doesn't seem so idealistic. So these are teachings that we receive, and these are things that Indigenous people tell settlers like Italian Canadians to think about as they live and build a life on this land. Here we have a full image of the one dish with one spoon covenant wampum agreement. Another quote about treaties from the 1700s, so fairly early on, from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We are glad to see you in our country and do accept of you to be our friends and allies, and do give you a belt of wampum as a token thereof that there may be a perpetual peace and friendship between us and our young Indians to hunt together in all love and amity. Now, we know, unfortunately, this friendship is not honored by the Canadian state in my particular context, with many Indigenous nations, sovereign nations on this land still very much struggling to self-determine. If you want to know more about these issues, I'm also working on a project with Dr. Angela Nardozzi, a colleague here at the University of Toronto, called Indigenous Italian-Canadian Connections. And that's the project website where we can learn a little bit more. Now, moving on to the core of the topic of the day, I have here two paintings. One is by an Indigenous artist, a Cree artist, that's the nation Cree, Kent Monkman, called Being Legendary. And so we see this often seen protagonist of Monkman's paintings. Their name is Mischief Eagle Testicle. And we see this eagle, and the eagle holds a lot of symbolism in many Indigenous worldviews. We see this eagle sort of lifting a mischief eagle testicle here. And I juxtapose this with Michelangelo's Ratto di Ganimede. So this myth that holds a lot of power for queer communities, right? So Zeus being so in love with this beautiful, beautiful boy, Ganymede, that he kidnaps him in the form of an eagle, right? And so we notice how art informs each other, and there's an element of queerness. So this is a really nice, I think, Indigenous Italian connection that we have here that is also related to sexuality. And we know that the regulation of sexuality and gender has been an instrument of colonial expansion in Canada in this context, and also elsewhere. Martin Cannon, who is an Indigenous Oneida professor here at the University of Toronto, tells us that colonial policies have worked to alter Indigenous understandings and traditions around gender and sexuality by institutionalizing, and I quote, a structure of power and kinship relations that were both patriarchal and heterosexist, unquote. These systems have also worked to racialize, to give an element of race to non-normative sexualities and to marginalize them, tells us Professor Cannon. These colonial systems of nation building, furthermore, force migrants like Italian Canadians to reproduce models of familial structures that fall within ideal citizenship. So to create models of the family and gender behavior, genderedness that situate them in proximity with the ideal of citizenship, and that therefore afford them particular privileges. And this is, of course, the case for Italians here in Canada, particularly white Italian Canadians, who greatly benefit from their European origins with respect to finding the rightful place in the trajectories of colonial projects, such as Canada. And we talked again about the figure of Giovanni Caboto, and also Cristoforo Colombo, but more in the United States, being central to the legitimization of Italian presence on these lands. It's also important to note that recently, some Western conceptions in particular of queer sexualities and genders have entered the mainstream and have acquired a lot of visibility. And in some ways, they have been co-opted or have contributed to even nationalism, nationalist endeavors. Scholar Jasper Puar tells us about this phenomenon called homo nationalism, in Italian homo nazionalismo. And so the project, Queer Italian Canadian Artists, tries to challenge the conception of the ideal white Italian Canadian citizen from the perspective of gender and sexuality. particularly as Italian-Canadian life relates to models of integration, assimilation, and production in order to achieve what queer scholar Sarah Ahmed describes as the promise of happiness. Okay, so this is what the project is about. We want to disrupt that narrative of Italian Canadians entering the mainstream through these familial patriarchal heterosexist structures. And I'm sorry, but I have to take a 2-second break here because these heels are magnificent. Questi tacchi sono assolutamente fantastici, non potevo non evidenziarli. How did the project Queer Italian Canadian Artists begin? Well, it began with actually a larger project directed by Dr. Licia Canton. And she was inspired by this article that you see on the screen here by Monica Meneghetti, titled, "I am queer and Italian Canadian. Coming out was twice as hard." Okay, so in this article, Monica Meneghetti talks about the intersection of queer identity and Italian Canadian identity and how that compounds, how these experiences intersect to produce a particular kind of hardship, of difficulty when it comes to living, an authentic life. And so there are elements of cultural production that fall within the queer Italian Canadian category. And I have some here for you. The project by Dr. Licia Canton actually led to the production of two particular pieces. One is a documentary titled Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian Canadian. The other is an anthology, Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing, for which I had the pleasure of writing part of the introduction. Other pieces, two pieces of queer Italian Canadian cultural production that I wanted to highlight are Mambo Italiano, which is a film about 20 years old now, if I'm not mistaken, that's inspired by a play by Steve Galluccio, who talks about, the play talks about a young Italian Canadian man who is queer and has to deal with all of the constrictive traditional elements of an Italian Canadian family. Another really beautiful piece of cultural production in the queer Italian Canadian realm is a short movie by Luis De Filippis, a filmmaker, for Nonna Anna. And we'll actually watch this short film now. And I have some questions for you as we watch. The film lasts about 12 minutes, 13 minutes. So sit back and relax and enjoy. A bit of a content warning. There are scenes of nudity. And I have questions for you on the screen. So the two questions that I want you to be thinking about as you watch this film are, what role does language play in the short film? We do want to talk about language today. So what role does language play in the short film? And how are barriers, including language barriers, between the two protagonists overcome? There are two protagonists in this film. One is an Italian grandmother who's very old, and one is a trans granddaughter who takes care of the grandmother. Okay, so what role does language play in the film, and how are barriers between the two protagonists, including language barriers, overcome? Okay, Silvia, let me know if there are any issues with streaming the video and audio.
Piano, mamma. Brava, brava. Careful, mommy, careful, careful. Let me lock the wheels for you. Girati piano. Brava, brava mamma. Adesso ti facciamo bella, come una principessa. Ti facciamo la doccia. Allora ti facciamo la doccia, mamma. No, mamma, dai, perché fai così? Non fai così, mamma, non fai così. Perché fai così? Ti vogliamo fare bella, come una principessa, mamma. Adesso ti togli la maglia. Fai, dai, mamma. Non fai così, mamma. Ciao, mamma. Ciao, mamma, ti voglio bene. Sì, mamma. Okay, Christina, Nana's ready for tomorrow. Give me kisses, give me kisses. Make sure that you bring Nana to the bathroom. Make sure she pees. Bye, Ma. See you tomorrow. Love you. Buonanotte. Bye, Chris. Hi. I'm just leaving my mom's house.
Bene, ma dimmi, hai risolto il tuo problema?
Non ancora, è difficile, lo sai.
Piuttosto dimmi, cosa voleva quella donna?
Non lo so, credimi.
Perché?
Perché? Perché ti amo.
Ho capito bene? Stai dicendo che mi ami? Hai proprio detto ti amo?
Let's go pee, Nonna.
Lasciatemi soli, andatevene alla casa. Andate, andate, andate. Io voglio
Please?
stare soli. Avete capito? Lasciatemi soli.
Are you sure you don't have to go to the washroom? Nonna. No fare pee-pee?
Christopher, get off the floor, please. Come on, Daddy, please. Chris, come on, you're all dirty. Nonna's not gonna let you in the house.
Yeah, she is.
Oh my God, what are you wearing?
Stuff.
I don't think Nonna's gonna appreciate you wearing her coat.
Oh, shut up, guarda meglio di me. Yeah. Batte le manine, a casa arriva va, sotto la cittadina e che la mangerà.
Nonna, can you do my hair?
Sì, sì. Stanno belli i capelli. Come sei bella.
Good morning, Nonna.
No, no, lasciami stare per piacere, lasciami stare, lasciami stare. No, lasciami stare per piacere.
Okay, so a short, but I think really, really powerful story and film. I would love to hear some thoughts, whether or not they are related to the questions that I have on the screen.
Hi, I'm Patty. I'm Sylvia's colleague. She stepped out a minute, so I'm going to step in. Who
Fair enough.
wants to start with making a comment?
Mhm.
I can relay the comments, or you can come up. I agree. It was a powerful film. Don't be shy. Yes, Virginia. As long as the microphone will reach, I'm going to pass it over to the students.
Great, thank you.
They broke barriers to communicate through actions, such as the girl shed her clothes in order to show that her grandmother wasn't more vulnerable than she was.
I love that comment. And what's your name, Virginia? Maybe.
Okay, who else has the
Yeah,
comment?
that's a beautiful comment. Yeah, I wanna sort of linger in that comment for a moment. So the piece on vulnerability is quite powerful. So we have, both the aging body as well as the trans body that sort of become vulnerable in their nudity and in their normalcy, really, in both respects, and they come together, and the granddaughter's willingness to expose herself then in turn helps the grandmother practice that kind of vulnerability so that they can take care of each other.
Yes, just a moment. Okay.
I wanted to make a parallelism because we see that both in when the girl was an infant, there's this scene we see recorded when she's with her grandma, and she's dressing her with her own clothes, and it's a very endearing moment. And also the very last scene when they're both together but undressed, and those were two great moments of vulnerability as well. And I think it's really beautiful to see both of them.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, the element of clothing is quite powerful, and the scene that you point to in terms of its linguistic content, spoken content, is also really powerful because someone whom we may assume to be at the time the father says something like, "Oh, Nonna is not going to appreciate you wearing her clothes," and then we hear the Nonna in Italiese. We could talk about Italiese for a while, but not today. We see the Nonna saying, "Oh, shut up, guarda meglio di me," right? Italiese, guarda meglio, looks better than me, right? And then Chris at the time is wearing something on her hair, and the Nonna says, "Come sei bella." Come sei bella. So in that case, we notice that the genderedness of Italian, which does not exist in English, it would have just been, "You're so pretty, you're so beautiful," though there is a gendered sort of dynamic between the word pretty and the word handsome. But beautiful could have been the genderless adjective. But in Italian, come sei bella is quite powerful in this case, is really affirming. And now we have the protagonist, the granddaughter, watching this film and remembering that connection, remembering the affirmation that the nonna provided to her, and in turn being motivated, being invigorated by it, so that she in turn can help the nonna now that she has become the caretaker. So really, really powerful. Thank you for pointing to that scene. Any other thoughts or questions or observations?
About language?
about the language, I was thinking about how Italian becomes the language of love and cure when the mother uses it, but at the same time, it cannot become the language of love when it comes to the granddaughter, because she uses the silence instead. That's the only way that she can overcome the barrier between them. I was thinking about this.
Yes, yeah, and this, thank you so much. That is often an issue, an intergenerational issue in Italian Canadian communities, is the language barrier, right? And teaching courses, as I do in Italian Canadian studies, is quite interesting, because I get to hear from students who talk about how they cannot communicate with their grandparents, but they find other languages, whether it's learning recipes to cook something, right? Or whether in this particular case, it's really coming together in a particular kind of intimacy that does not need to be linguistically mediated like it does with, you know, the daughter and the mother. In this case, language is almost not there. We hear the granddaughter use some Italian, but we can tell it's quite limited. And so there is another language of intimacy, and silence certainly can be a powerful one. So thank you. That's a beautiful comment. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again and perhaps move on to the next video that I'm going to show you. It's much shorter. It's actually, and you can see my screen, I hope. Okay, it's actually the trailer. Oh, and I have to make sure I can, there we go. Okay. All right, so this is the trailer. I'm going to show you the trailer of the documentary Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian Canadian. It's very short, it's about 3 minutes long, but the full documentary is available. I can ask the director for permission to share it with you if you would like to see it. It's about 30 minutes long. And this documentary features 4 people. The one you see on the screen is Liana Cusmano, who's an Italian-Canadian poet, writer, amongst other things, and who is trans. And then we have Chris Diraddo, who's an Italian-Canadian writer as well. Steve Galluccio, you may remember Mambo Italiano from one of my previous slides. So this is the person whose play inspired the film Mambo Italiano, as well as Dominic Beneventi, who is a scholar who sort of comments more theoretically on Italian-Canadian queer realities. And again, I have some questions here for you to guide your thoughts, but I will welcome any feedback related to the film. So the questions are, how does the intersection of queer and Italian-Canadian identities affect the experience of these writers, as far as we can tell from the trailer? And what role does language play here as well? Now, if only it would work, that would be so nice. Okay.
So do I look relaxed? Is it okay?
No, you really relaxed.
So my name is Christopher Dorado.
Liana Cusmano.
Galluccio, and I was born in Montreal, in Little Italy, actually.
The safest place that I have felt being queer in any way was while writing.
But I knew that growing up that I was a little afraid to kind of reveal this part of myself to the Italian side of my family.
Even my Italian friends are like, "You're never going to make it." My extended family, "You're never going to make it." It's not for it, because it's not for us.
So many people will challenge you and ask you to justify yourself. Why are you here? Who are you? Prove to me that you're trans and that you deserve to occupy this public space.
In my 20s, I was hidden. I was in the closet from my family.
And I'm not going to show up to my grandmother's house and like gender myself correctly. It's awful every time.
You're not supposed to be gay. That's changed a lot.
I can remember being, as a kid, really being afraid about my future.
But I knew that I would never be able to constrain myself. So many of us were raised to live in a world that doesn't exist anymore.
You know, given enough time, you will find your tribe and you will find people who will love you for you.
I can tell like I'm part of something that's bigger than me, and I can help other people hopefully feel like they're part of something that's bigger than them.
I guess I did belong, but I just didn't know it.
I can see the love she will have for me, a love deeper than anything I've ever felt from a man. And that scares me, frightens me that I can do all of those things I do to men, press my body up against theirs in a variety of different ways. But no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to get them to stay inside. I can't make them love me. And with my mother, there is no effort. It's just there, as constant and infinite as the universe.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want me to read it again, or that was fine?
That was perfect.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay, so once again, I welcome any thoughts or reactions to this very short clip that we've seen with respect to, what do we notice in the Italian-Canadian experience? What are some things that emerge from the very short clip?
I noticed in the video of the person that was talking about not wanting to gender themselves correctly, going to their grandmother's house. And I guess it's because in Italian, everything is so gendered, expressing any other kind of identity is a little difficult. We're working on it, but it's really difficult. And I guess the cultural barriers, the language barrier there is actually pretty intense.
Exactly. So thinking about having to self-translate in this particular case, the trans non-binary experience into another context, and the role of Romance languages, Italian in particular, in this translation, self-translation, and the choice for safety to misgender oneself in this very gendered context, perhaps even when speaking English, having to misgender oneself because of what you also mentioned, the relationship between the language, but also and the culture. And so the cultural elements of a particular traditional context that force the person to misgender themselves in order to be able to navigate, to operate in that context. And Liana in particular says, we were raised in a world that does not exist anymore. So this really speaks to that cultural context that you point to, particularly with respect to the fossilization, sometimes we could say crystallization of Italian cultures in Canada. We see this very much linguistically with the regional languages, dialetti, still very much being in use, perhaps more than in Italy, statistically speaking. And so culturally, that is also the case. So having to navigate a culture that is in some ways crystallized at the moment of migration, and that does not necessarily quote unquote exist anymore, at least not in the homeland. It's this very sort of sui generis kind of cultural context. Any other thoughts or feedback on the film, the trailer?
Paolo, can you focus a little bit more about this opposition between past and present in terms of perception? Because just to continue what you were just saying, the fact that that speaker, but also others, I assume, have a crystallized idea of Italian gender identities, and in general, I think Italian culture, even food, or some food practices are there that might be connected with the past. So the idea is, where is the present? Is there a present in relation to this crystallized past? I don't know if my question is making sense. There's so many things to talk about, in this big binary between past and present.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of queer in a way when we think of queer temporalities. It's kind of queer in a way because we have this very sort of non-linear context when it comes to the chronology, the temporality of it. We have this context where, of course, these things exist in the present, but they are rooted in a particular social and cultural experience that in the homeland, Italy, southern Italy in particular, has evolved because time has progressed. Here it has evolved in contact with, of course, in my context, Anglo culture, right? Canadian culture, English Canadian culture, in the Quebec context with French Canadian culture. So there is some contact, some attrition, some evolution, but there are elements of it that are still very much rooted in an experience that no longer that no longer exists back home. There is this sort of relationship with difference that Italian Canadians and Italian diasporic communities experience, especially when visiting the homeland. a lot of our Italian Canadians, Italian Canadian youth, a lot of Italian Canadian students talk about what it means for them to go home, and even sometimes use words that people will say, no one says that here anymore, right? Or speak about foods, making foods in the home, saying, we don't really, this is not really a family practice here anymore. Like here in Toronto, people making tomato sauce for the entire year, right? And so we have these crystallized practices, which of course are in conversation with the present and experience, contact and attrition with the Canadian context, but are rooted, anchored in an Italian past that no longer is, and they have things to teach us. So I don't think about these things as obsolete or as useless. I think about these things as potentially quite generative, because when we talk about ancestral tradition, when we talk about Indigenous people who are reclaiming their languages and their practices against the assimilation of the Canadian state in this particular context, then we have these Italian cultures that can tell us a lot about who we are and what it means to be on this land, right? They can provide a sense of groundedness that perhaps is being lost in Italy even more or more quickly.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to keep going. And so we're talking about queer and Italian Canadian, and this is an important intersection. And of course, one of the theories that come to mind when we think about intersections of experiences is the theory of intersectionality, of which Kimberly Crenshaw, of whom you may have heard, is of course the proponent and the person who has been working on this particular theory since the 1990s in an African-American legal context in particular, to acknowledge the compounded nature of some experiences of oppression, right? And so Kimberly Crenshaw uses as her central figure of analysis the Black woman. What does it mean to be a Black woman? How is this experience of race and how is this experience of gender compounded to produce something that is probably more than the sum of the parts and is quite nuanced? And how does this apply to the legal context when we think about things like hate crimes? Was this a hate crime related to race? Was this a hate crime related to gender? And I have a video here of Kimberly Crenshaw herself explaining intersectionality in quite, I would say, clear terms. And we can think about how theory of intersectionality can apply to the queer Italian Canadian context. We think back to the article by Monica Veneghetti, I Am Queer and Italian Canadian. Coming out was twice as hard. So she speaks of the sort of compounded nature of those two experiences and identities. And how can intersectionality help us? So let's find out what intersectionality is if we haven't heard about it before. Oh, I'm losing something. Something happened here. 1 second. I'm so happy we are back in the classroom here in Toronto because I did not miss Zoom. And it's nice to use Zoom so we remember how much we do not miss it sometimes. Okay, there we go. I think that should be fine. Allora, play.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African-American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
Okay, so Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw teaches us that, again, these experiences can intersect in particular ways, and we must acknowledge that intersection so that we don't just treat or address a part of it, but that we can address it in a holistic way. And she identifies, I won't get into it in the interest of time, but she identifies 3 particular types of intersectionality. One is structural intersectionality. So how does an experience of oppression, such as gender oppression, but other types of oppression as well, how is it a product of a historical subordination? So we can think about issues of poverty, education, and so on in particular communities. She identifies political intersectionalities. So how can political agendas actually acknowledge the combination of particular experiences so that feminism doesn't only worry about one particular kind of women, maybe rich women, maybe white women. And so that, race also can acknowledge, or anti-racist activism or political activity can also acknowledge the experience of gender. And representational intersectionality. So how do cultural images, cultural imaginaries inform and relay the experiences, the combined experiences of particular identities? And I think this is where the work of the Queer Italian Canadian Artists Project plays a part here, showing how the cultural intersection or the intersection, the representational intersection of queer and Italian Canadian experiences then can give life to cultural production. And we have people in the Italian context who have spoken about intersectionality as well, ante litteram, I would say. Mario Mieli, you may have heard of Mario Mieli, who's the writer of an important text in queer studies in Italy. Again, ante litteram, queer studies, we're talking about the 1970s. Elementi di critica omosessuale is the text that he wrote and published in the 1970s that became probably what is even currently the most important text related to gender and sexuality, particular sexual liberation in the Italian context, right? And he talks about this intersection and how different point of views can actually combine to help us address issues, again, in a holistic way. He tells us, la lotta delle donne e le espressioni teoriche del loro movimento hanno chiarito quanto l'ideologia sia fallocentrica, imperniata sulla soggezione del sesso femminile a quello maschile, almeno tanto quanto è fondata sul modo di produzione capitalistico. Quanto poi l'ideologia dominante sia bianca ed eurocentrica, ciò è stato letteralmente messo a fuoco dalle lotte dei neri, che insorgendo nei ghetti d'America nel corso degli anni 70 e distruggendo le città del capitale, hanno riaperto per la specie umana la prospettiva della rivoluzione comunista, la prospettiva dell'emancipazione umana. And when Mario Mieli talks about communism, he's really talking about collectivism. He was not interested in any political affiliation. Che infine l'ideologia sia eterosessuale, ciò è quanto noi omosessuali abbiamo messo in luce per la prima volta in modo dirompente nel corso degli ultimi anni, dalla fondazione del Gay Liberation Front a New York nell'estate del 1969 ad oggi. And he continues, il proletariato per sé e la lotta delle donne, dei neri e di noi gay hanno insegnato a cogliere l'importanza fondamentale ai fini dell'emancipazione umana di tutto ciò che, in rapporto ai valori assolutizzati dall'ideologia, viene considerato marginale, secondario, anomalo o addirittura assurdo. La vita della specie sta là. So we see how Mario Mieli acknowledges how the different political agendas can actually come together to show particular problems in the experience of life under, capitalism, and colonialism, and come together and really pull apart the many facets in a way that is actually quite effective and quite generative. So I wanted to connect the idea of intersectionality to an Italian theorist, in case you're interested in reading more, Mario Mieli, Elementi di critica omosessuale. Now, the project, with respect to its methodology, I'll share a little bit about what we do. We are currently collective interviews, and we're interested in the experiences, as I'm sure is clear, of LGBTQ+ or queer Italian Canadians. And how have the traditional values of Italian Canadian communities often led to the marginalization of its queer members? But also, what are the contributions of queer Italian Canadians to Italian Canadian cultural and social life? And who are the most marginalized and unacknowledged in the queer community? So also recognizing hierarchies of oppression through intersectionality within the queer community, right? A white gay man is able to navigate society in a way that is quite different from a Black trans woman of color, or a lesbian. And so we want to acknowledge those hierarchies, those particular power dynamics within the community. You'll see some pictures here. This is Gruppo Italiano Gay e Lesbico di Montreal, a historical group, I don't think any longer active in Montreal. So as we do this work, we also want to acknowledge the efforts of those who have come before us to try to address and reconcile in some way the Italian Canadian experience and the queer experience in this context. Some of the questions that we ask, so this is what our questionnaire is based on, and we've collected 10 interviews so far. We are beginning to conduct some analysis actually with Dr. Michela Baldo, who I believe was speaking with you some time ago. And so some of the points of analysis that we'll be applying to both the interviews and the text is, first of all, understanding the demographic history, the family history of the queer Italian Canadian artists. We're interested in their ethno-linguistic vitality. So first of all, do they identify as Italian, Canadian, Italian, Canadian, Canadian, Italian? It can be a combination of a number of things. What's their relationship to Italian languages and cultures? Do they speak Italian? Do they not? Are they first, second, third generation? We want to think about hetero and homonormativity within their family context. We want to think about gender performativity, how they experience gender in the particular context. For example, we heard about the need to misgender oneself, or the need to dress or behave a particular way in order to navigate an Italian Canadian environment, or places and spaces in the larger Italian Canadian community beyond the domestic space. We want to ask and understand pieces that are related to experiences of marginalization. So is there a sense of belonging for queer Italian Canadians within the Italian Canadian community? Are there experiences of marginalization? Are there experiences of wishing, of what we could call anti-sociality? Are there experiences of wishing to do away with one's Italian Canadian identity because of the conflict between Italian traditions, generally speaking, and queer identity? We want to understand what kinship networks, chosen families, Italian Canadians harness in order to live a full life or even create. It's interesting, and we want to understand more about the Italian elements of those kinship networks. Do queer Italian Canadians often connect with other queer Italian Canadians, or do they enter sort of the quote unquote mainstream queer community in Canada? And then we think about their actual creative work. So what motivates them to write or draw or create films like the one that you have seen? Are there Italian elements to their work? And we have seen, for Nonnanna has a strong Italian element. Is there a political agenda to their work? Are they trying to communicate something to a particular audience? Do they have to censor parts of their work when they are presenting to an Italian Canadian audience? For example, Monica Meneghetti talks about how in the past in particular, when she presented her work, her writing to an Italian Canadian audience, she would pick passages of her book that had to do more with food than relationships and sexuality, okay? and then hopes for the future, particularly with respect to how the intersection between queer and Italian Canadian identities can evolve. To give you an idea or a taste of the interviews that we're collecting, I have 3 very short clips here that are ready to go on Instagram as reels, so you'll notice the format. And this is Liana Cusmano. You've seen them in the documentary, and they were also interviewed by the project.
I would say that I genuinely feel welcome in the Italian Canadian community, but there are lots of ways for me to make that happen that are not nearly, I don't nearly feel as welcome in the Italian Canadian community as I would at a poetry slam full of like young queer trans kids, but that presupposes a lot of things about the Italian Canadian community on my part. It's based on like all these assumptions that I could challenge and that I probably ought to challenge.
So here, as we see, Liana Cusmano talks about how they navigate Italian Canadian communities, and sometimes choose to avoid doing so or navigating it in a particular way based on assumptions, assumptions that they want to challenge. This is Monica Meneghetti from Vancouver.
I mean, I've always known that I had an Italian background, but I've never actually felt like I was part of a community of Italian Canadians until after I published my memoir. And prior to that, I really wasn't connected to it in the same way, partly because of the writing and partly because of sort of the connections that happened because of the book. I'm now much more fully embracing, okay, I'm Italian Canadian, like this is a really big part of why I am the way I am.
And then the last interview by Anthony Portulese from Montreal.
And I spent a great deal of my own teenage and young adulthood, teenage years and young adulthood, not just trying to come to terms with my own sexuality, but also trying to figure out what that Italianita meant for me. What did it mean to be Italian for me?
And as I was mentioning earlier, these interviews are extracted from larger interviews, about 2 to 3 hours long, that we've collected with about 10 Italian Canadian writers in particular, and that we are continuing to collect. Silvia, how am I doing for time? How much more do we have?
I would say not that long. We'll give it a 5 minutes. Can you, so that we can have a final question and catching up. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. So thank you. So I'll show some texts quickly. These are from the anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing, to think about the issue of translation and self-translation. So we will not read the text in the interest of time, but you can see that this piece was translated, I believe, by the author herself, Elena Basile, who also teaches here at the University of Toronto. And we noticed that the Italian version on the left is much more prosaic, whereas the English version on the right seems to have more of a poetic structure. So we can think of all kinds of implications to do with translation and self-translation within the queer Italian Canadian experience. We see that it's also quite dialogical in some ways. There are questions that are posed in the English that are not present in the Italian. The English is also much more fractured, again, in things like in portions that seem to recall verses, whereas the Italian is much more discursive, we could say. This is a poem that I wrote for the anthology, and here I can just show you quickly that I use different languages. I use Italian, and I use Calabrese, Picciri, Iuduci, Antiporta Chiusa, and of course I use English, so we can think about when authors use particular languages for particular ways, especially in an Italian Canadian context. What languages, and we were talking about this before, have more of an intimate or domestic currency and what languages have more of a public kind of function, okay? And the last text I wanted to show you, because of the title mainly, is Let Them Mangia Cake. I wanted to teach you this Italian-Canadian word from Italiese, which is this sort of amorphous combination of Southern Italian languages and English in particular. Mangia cake is the word that Italian-Canadians use to refer to non-Italians, especially Anglo-Saxon non-Italians. Mangia cake referring to the fact that, perhaps, the assumption here is that non-Italians eat more cakes, more sugar, white bread in particular. And we notice this language being harnessed in literature, but also in activism. This is a poster by a group called Italian Canadians for Black Lives. And we see how this term is used in almost a sort of an exclusionary, perhaps borderline insulting way. If you don't support Black Lives Matter, then you are a mangia cake. So lots to think about when exploring Italian-Canadian language landscapes. And my very last slide, where I thank you, features some images of a campaign by Italian-Canadian queer activists for Italian-Canadian, but also other students at the Toronto Catholic District School Board. There were some issues, homophobic issues within the Toronto Catholic District School Board recently. And so these activists produced images to send to young queer kids, and that say things like, you have the Madonna here saying, I say, pray for the gay to stay. Happy Valentine's Day, your queer Italian paisan and allies. So again, here we think of the use of language when it is employed, when Italian or Italian regional languages are employed to create community kinship, and how this comes alive in the intersection of queer and Italian-Canadian experiences. And here, of course, we have Lady Gaga as well, wishing young queer Italian Canadians and non-Italian Canadians a happy Valentine's Day. Grazie mille. Thank you so much. All right, so I can see you again.
Clapping. Thank you, Paolo. Thank you so much. Thank you for this amazing lesson. It is also timely because yesterday we've been talking about the movements and the LGBT movements up to the 1970s. And thank you for introducing Mario Mieli, because he's a figure I haven't talked about, but actually was queer, in the 1970s already. And that's really, really incredible. Whereas tomorrow we're going to talk about intersectionality. And actually, Paolo has just showed you Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the founder of this movement, and intersections that you get when you start thinking about race, gender, class. And this is exactly what we have been doing. And thank you, Paolo, for this. And for showing us lots of examples with real life interviews, but also documentaries, films, and theoretical reflection. There's lots of food for thought. So thank you so much. And it's incredible. We're going to talk about that also tomorrow and next week from the final week of our lessons. Are there any questions or things that you might want to ask Paolo? I know that there's been lots of concepts, ideas, some new, some examples also of issues we have talked about. Anything else? Yes.
I do have a question, not regarding Italian Canadian community, but the indigenous languages, because I was in Toronto in February and I went to Rome and I've seen the Being Legendary Mostra in person, and I remember being like the descriptions were both in English and French as usual per Canada, and also in an indigenous language. And my boyfriend is Canadian, and he was telling me that in some areas the indigenous languages are just as recognized as English and French, so you have to have etiquette basically in all three languages. But if there are multiple language families, which language is actually used, like indigenous ones?
Oh, that's a really good question. I got to see that exhibition on the very last day, so we share that experience. I know Professor Antosa saw it too while she was here. Amazing artist. Weren't the paintings beautiful? The language at that particular exhibit, I believe, was Cree. I could be mistaken, but I believe the language is Cree because that is the home nation of the artist Kent Monkman. So that would make sense to me, but I could be wrong. And usually what you will see with respect to linguistic visibility is the original language of the particular place that you are. So for example, Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area falls within the Anishinaabeg Nation. So the language that you most often see, but not often enough, I want to highlight, especially here, there is an increase in the visibility of Indigenous languages as you move west in Canada, and that sort of follows the process of colonization. And the language that you see here in the Greater Toronto Area most often is usually Anishinaabemowin or Ojibwe, and that's one of the most common original languages of this particular area into the United States. So we also want to recognize the way in which modern political borders do not acknowledge the sovereign nations that actually crossed over those very borders. Another common language in Ontario is Kanyangaha or Mohawk. So those are the languages that you will see. So oftentimes the language that you will see is the original languages, the original language of the nation or nations that continue to inhabit. I want to highlight the contemporary nature of Indigenous languages and cultures, the particular place where you find yourself.
Thank you. Any other questions? You can find Paolo Frascà's email address in case you might want to get in touch with him on the University of Toronto website. It's name and surname. You look up Paolo Frascà and you will find out his own page with a presentation, and there are all the useful links to the Frank Iacobucci Center and all the projects he's leading or co-leading or that they are doing at the department. It's a very rich department. It's very lively, and lots of projects you might want to be, to take a look at, and in case inquiry. Paolo will be very, I hope, happy to answer any further questions which may come from emails. And so, Paolo, thank you so much again for this lovely lesson. And I'd like to, let's clap for Paolo again. Thank you. Thank you so much.
For you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Silvia, for this opportunity. Grazie davvero. We miss you here. So please, let's connect again soon. And thank you all for listening today. Buona giornata.
Thank you. Thank you. E Paolo, puoi chiudere la registrazione, per favore, so that we can save it.
There we go.